I mean, you're not going to want to miss Urmila, because Urmila Mohan is our final speaker before our panel discussion. Now, on Friday, last Friday, we had a very similar symposium in terms of structure, not topic. The topic was the Byzantine codices, and I was able to introduce our final speaker then, who was our visiting faculty curator of that exhibition, Georgios Boudalis, by not only pointing out, as I had earlier, his various academic achievements, but also that he is an artist. And I can say exactly the same about Urmila Mohan. I don't want to rehearse her various academic achievements once again. Instead, I want to highlight the fact that at the root of everything she has done is a basic artist sensibility, and this in part stems from her earlier experience as a student at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad in India. So it is as an artist, as well as a scholar, that I invite Urmila to come to the podium.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. So this talk basically just recapitulates some of the ideas that I have been trying to work through the medium of the exhibit. So you could see this talk perhaps as being in conjunction with the exhibit. For a small island, Bali produces textiles of overwhelming diversity. The ways in which textiles come to be important in Balinese life are different from the manner in which they are collected or displayed in Western museums. Most Balinese practice a unique form of Hinduism with historical roots in Hindu sects of South India, which was later transformed into a composite belief system. The Hindu deities worshipped by the Balinese include Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. And the rituals are combinations of practices with Hindu, Buddhist, and animist elements. So here we have a view of the Indonesian textile case in the Hall of Pacific People that was curated by Margaret Mead. And many of the textiles in this case, even though it is a case on Indonesia and not on Bali, many of the pieces are actually from Bali, and this was a starting point to get an idea of how she thought about textiles as a patchwork of Indonesian cultures, and how she was also paying attention to issues of technique and making. One way to understand the importance of Balinese textiles is through their culture of making and use, where cloth acts as an interface between the external and the internal, the tangible and the intangible, and the visible and the invisible, or the sekala and the niskala. And here we see the map of locating Bali over there in Indonesia, as well as a ritual use of the cloth in a tooth filing ceremony. And for those of you who've been to the exhibit, you've seen a cloth, the actual cloth there on exhibit. In order to talk about continuity, cloth as continuity in Balinese culture, I rely on evidence from the Mead ethnographic papers, as well as artifacts collected by Margaret Mead and the anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, among others, as well as their contemporaries, as well as, of course, my brief visit to Bali. I thought that these two quotations kind of work together and perhaps say something more about what we are, the complexity of what we're trying to deal with. So we have an eminent scholar of Balinese art like Hildred Geertz talking about Sakti as power. And she talks about this capacity to create this envelope of safety. So this protective aspect of cloth comes to the fore, of power comes to the fore in her description. And then also the idea of ritual, where things that we cannot see but somehow can feel or sense through objects like textiles are as real and have as much agency as those tangible entities. So you're always mediating between these realms of existence and life and experience. The realm of the invisible can contain powerful divine and ancestral spirits, as well as demonic entities. Rituals serve to mediate between the three levels of existence, the human, the divine, and the demonic. And cloths are potential homes for spirits whose energy can be directed towards human advantage or loss. So not quite the idea of good and evil, but more the idea that the power of these objects can be directed as a human being to positive or negative, and obviously to your own advantage. The making of certain kinds of ritual cloths, called babali, can be directly related to the production and containment of supernatural power, and the spiritual value that the Balinese place on cloth, as evidenced in Balinese Hindu mythology and usage, reinforces the importance of weaving as an act that literally generates power. I tend to use the words like supernatural and spiritual, and I use these as conjunctions with the idea of power. We don't have time here to actually delve into the connotations of that, but I put them together as a toolkit. So here we have a beautiful painting from the American Museum of Natural History, and we have a reproduction in the exhibit. And this is so beautifully symbolizes aspects of the exhibition, where we have mythology, we have a scene from the Adi Parva, interpreted within Balinese Hinduism by adding this layer of a story of Kalarao, trying to just completely swallow Devi Rati, the lunar goddess or the moon goddess. And she is somebody who's held up as a idol or an ideal to weavers. You weave well when you think of Devi Rati. Now, the actual mythology behind the story is something you can read about when you go to the exhibit. But the reason I include this here is to say that there's an idea of tension and binding and knotting, as you see in the cosmic struggle between the gods and the demons, and the churning of the cosmic oceans. And so whether it's the snake that's being knotted and tied and bound and pulled, or whether it's this idea of weaving with the warp and the weft, this idea of tension is there. So Balinese weaving and the principle of tension that it depends upon incorporates cosmological ideas of tying and binding, whether from Southeast Asian beliefs or from Hindu conceptions of the world. For instance, as you see in this myth over here, the churning of the cosmic ocean relates to the idea, I argue, relates to the idea of the principles by which the looms operate. In a Balinese backstrap loom called the chug-chug, the weaver's body is integrated with the loom. The weaver provides the force needed to keep the warp as taut or as relaxed as needed by moving her body, as well as the motion needed to lift the string heddles and to create a shed. Many of the small gestures that weavers use to create textiles are not consciously learned, but are part of the tacit knowledge of generations of weavers, often passed from mother to daughter. In many cases, the loom itself was also inherited, and the weaving blade or the sword or the beater was emblematic of a woman's skill and productivity. So in effect, you could say without the presence of the body, there would be no tension, and without that tension, there would be no cloth. Hence, one kind of fundamental power we're dealing with here is the translation of physical force. So these two forces, the body and the loom, the warp and the weft, constitute the fundamental axes of textile innovation. But weaving is not just mechanics. The weaver is a thinking, sensing agent who is constantly responding to the limits and capacities of her body and the materials she works with. Dye baths may not work, yarn may break, and complex weaves could stymie a young weaver. Weavers and dyers certainly rely on their skill, but they also invoke the aid and protection of higher powers, such as Devi Rati, featured again here in this contemporary painting, the moon goddess, who is believed to have given the knowledge of weaving to humanity. And this is from the Fowler Museum and the various disembodied limbs and demonic forces surrounding her. Those who produce cloths in Bali must first worship the deities and continue to make daily offerings. Here, offerings are not just a matter of ritual, but are believed to actually contribute to the weaver's ability to realize her intentions and to create charismatic power through her cloth. Another aspect is what the Balinese describe as kala, patra, and sthana, which is the time, place, and situation, which also has to be right. A Balinese translator noted that the most important thing was the rasa, or the feeling that the weaver had when they made something. The rasa came from the purpose, and whether it was for a god or for a ceremony, what was the goal? Nowadays, though, most weavers, he argued, just focused on doing the job and finishing it. So there was no rasa, there was no taksu, there was no charisma, and there was no connection invoked with the deities or with the final user. Hence, if made without one of those ingredients, the cloth would be champa or insipid or flavorless and without power. So there's a notion of power that comes from that idea of feeling being embodied in the making. While discussing the kinds of powers embodied, Dayu, a master weaver, explained that the cloths made traditionally had more taksu or charisma than today because the weavers would follow certain prescriptions, such as starting their work on specific days, having their worshipping at the taksu shrine, having certain rituals, making their daily offerings of chanang, and that there were also specific days on which you would cut the cloth from the warp if you wanted the cloth to sell. Now, other cloths known as gedogan or wangsul, and this is a direct connection to something that Ruth talked about in her talk about the continuous warp cloths. They are not cut from the warp if they are intended to be used as deity offerings, but are woven in such a way that they can be taken off the loom intact, and you would do that by dismantling the loom. As Ruth observed in her discussion of cloth as bride wealth, there was a power to that cloth. You do not cut the warp. On a much smaller scale, you could say something is happening over here where there is a belief that the uncut warp has a power that belongs to the realm of the ancestors or the otherworldly, and that to contain that power and to be able to reuse that power, you would not want to cut that warp. In this case, of course, it's a different cultural context. It's a Hindu Balinese context, and this cloth would be, even though it is an archaic design, simple lines and stripes, the meaning is obviously culturally contextualized. So it's called, in this case, you would say, the pattern is called Sugi Renda, which in Balinese literally means humble and rich, or rich and humble. And the colors are designed, this is what the weaver says, the colors are designed in such a way that the textile conveys a feeling of wealth, but not in an ostentatious manner. And for people who are familiar with Balinese culture, you know there's always this emphasis on dualism. You try to counteract one with the other. An emphasis on modesty and humility, as well as the attraction and the richness of the colors. So as such, this textile embodies a philosophy of dualism and opposing but necessary forces, or Rawa Beneda. Gedogan itself is believed to contain spiritual power owing to the cyclical structure, and they are believed to harness human appetites, which are difficult to control. The term wangsul, which is also used for Gedogan cloths, literally means to return or to come back, and hence you could say that the power of cyclicality and continuity is embodied in the fabrication of the cloth, as well as its intended use in a ritual or ceremonial life cycle. The power of cloth can also be related to the qualities of a material world, and the colors and patterns are often related to the availability of raw materials and the flora and fauna of an environment. Materials mediate between domains we would otherwise consider separate. For instance, the power of a natural dye may be related to the esoteric nature of dyeing knowledge, and I believe someone spoke about Janet Hoskins and the power of indigo baths, as well as the socio-cultural importance and position of the dyer in a specific community. Now, some of these values are entangled with spiritual beliefs about the magic of the dye bath, and dyes may possess medicinal properties. Traditionally, in Tenganan Pergaringsingan, an ancient Pali Aga village in the regency of Karangasem, it was believed that the deep red dye of these cloths came from the use of human blood. Now, the other inhabitants of Bali believed this, and they believed that the people of this village wielded certain kind of black magic powers. With the revival of weaving in the village and the tourist market, it's probably better known now that the red dye comes from the root bark of the morinda tree, but such myths persist, perpetuating a belief in the alchemical power of the ingredients, as well as the restricted knowledge needed to manipulate these materials and to produce these kind of effects. Now, so far I've talked about the mechanism of tension in the weaving, as well as the need for ritual observances and the right materials. In addition, there is also the power of draping or tying the cloth in a particular way that resonates, some value connected with power. One could argue in the Balinese context that holding something in your lap, or indeed the holding of anything, whether an object or a person, is a fundamental bodily technique of demonstrating and establishing intimacy with that entity. And two beautiful photographs from the archives show Bateson's interest and his eye for actions and gestures, and he's captured the making of a sling with cloth. In the left-hand side, it's a cremation, and these young women are literally caught in the act of creating this sling in which they carry the funerary effigy, much like you would carry a baby. And on the right-hand side, just as a comparison, we see how the actual salandang or chest wrapper will be tied as a baby sling to carry an infant. And for me, all of this ties into this notion of cyclicality, continuity, and that the elliptical nature of the sling that's created relates to this idea of circularity that we see also in the gedogan, or the continuous warp cloth, in a different manifestation. We also have to note that Margaret Mead herself had noted something about the power of salandang when she made the comment that Rangda was waving her cloth, which you call sakti, or power. But she also says the name for that cloth, although Mead does not give the name for that cloth was something connected with a cloth you would use as a baby sling. Now we know that salandang are used so I don't know whether it's the same thing or not, but clearly some connection there between the baby carrier as well as the power of sakti. Now, to move into a more anthropological note, the concepts of rite of passage first proposed by Arnold van Gennep, one of the original group of the Durkheimian sociologists, and a major contributor to the field of comparative religion. Well, according to Van Gennep, the life of any individual is marked by a series of transitions from one social state to another, and marked by three phases, which is separation, transition, and incorporation. And rites of passage marks major points in a Balinese individual's life and can include birth, puberty, marriage, and funerals. And culturally, you need special ceremonies and rituals to transition the individual from one stage to the next. Complex beliefs shape the use of textiles in life ceremonies from infancy to death, culminating in the transformation of the human soul into an ancestral spirit. And at every stage, cloth wraps the body to ensure protection and well-being. There are several important rituals in a Balinese life cycle. Infancy, youth, and death is what we focus on in the exhibit, and I'll talk more about that. Now, although there are variations in the opulence of these ceremonies, and also I'm assuming there are also variations depending on the caste that you belong to, traditional Balinese textiles are an integral part. They are used to clothe and protect the bodies of participants who are particularly vulnerable during these moments of transition. And through these ceremonies, textiles become material manifestations of intangible ideas and beliefs, such as the cyclical nature of life. Another observation, of course, is that textiles are simply used to make people beautiful, to ornament the body. And they become a second skin that shape the form and appearance of the people participating, including the ritual participant. So we could say, in a ceremonial context, the striking wrappers worn by Balinese are enchanting because they affect the other people there with their charisma. And similarly, we can think of buildings and shrines as also being similarly wrapped and decorated and dressed, much like the beautiful lamak that we have donated by Colin McPhee to the Natural History Museum. And as these ritually powerful textiles and the associated paraphernalia are used, they become animated, and you could say they also are ceremonial participants as much as the human beings who are there. So there are three kinds of roughly 3 kinds of rites. You have Manusa Yajna, which is the birth and development rites, Pitra Yajna, which is death and deification rites, Deva Yajna, supplication to deities, and Tomo Bhuta Yajna for demons, and Rishi Yajna for spiritual elevation. There are also 3 rites of qualities. So you have Uttama, Madhya, and Nista. So the highest quality, the middle, and the low. Similarly, clothing can also be Agung, which is royal or supreme, Madhya again the middle, and Sadharana, which is the everyday or the lowest purpose. Now, we don't have to be so strict about these categories, but that's one way of thinking about it. And as I said, nearly everybody and everything is dressed for the occasion. So the first ritual is Nelubulanin, and we had a wealth of archival material and photographs and notes because Mead was interested in development, in child development, and she had all these photographs of babies and mothers. And as Adrian so correctly pointed out, she was one of the earliest people, perhaps the largest corpus of work on women, paying attention to women's activities, including child rearing. And in the course of her research in Bali, Mead accurately observed that in Balinese culture, ancestors and offspring were one, and that the gods were really the children of the living. Children could also be gods, and at least for the first 3 months of their lives, after which the infant formally descends from the realm of the deities to the realm of the human in a process of Wangsul. So Wangsul again invokes the idea of the Gerugan or the Wangsul plot, or return to earth. Now the Nelubulan or the Telubulan, or literally the 3rd moon or month, is also the first time the child's feet are allowed to touch the ground. An associated rite of Nyambutin, which literally means reaching, is performed where the soul is welcomed into the body. And prior to this, the child would have been carried everywhere by siblings and neighbors. But after the Nyambutin, he or she is formally welcomed as an entity belonging to the human world. And we have this beautiful wrapper that I'm very curious to learn more about, because it's quite a tiny thing. Nothing as monumental as what you see here, but in the exhibit it's very small but also very powerful. And it seems to be a chapuk-like design that's been incorporated with some kind of interesting asymmetry in that design. On the right-hand side, we have Madi Kaler, who was Mead and Bateson's secretary, Balinese secretary, and very soon became a research participant. When you remember in one of the notes, he actually is a little bit miffed that Mead is not paying attention to his family as a potential source of information. So this is an occasion where, for his nephews, his brother's sons, Nelubulanin, he asks for Mead and Bateson to come and document it. So we see him not only participating as a member of the family, but also documenting the process, which is kind of interesting. Maybe that speaks to a little bit of what Adrian was talking about, the agency and the participation and the role that the Balinese occupy. Now, instead of performing the initial Nelubulanin ceremony with the child, a changeling can be used. In this case, it's a banana flower. And sometimes they wrap the banana flower in a Wangsul or a bebali, which is protective. And we note from Mead's notes and from Bateson's photographs that in Buleleng and Siam in the 1930s, this changeling was a banana flower dressed with bracelets and necklace and I believe even anklets. In other parts of Bali, the changeling could be a pumpkin, a cucumber, or a gourd. But regardless of what is being used, the purpose of the changeling is to fool the spirits into thinking that the proxy is the real baby, and therefore to focus their attention on it. So after the initial rituals are performed, the changeling is thrown away as something that is impure, and the actual baby is then dressed. And I find this textile also quite fascinating because we don't know anything about this. I'll go back to that. The next event is tooth filing. And Susan and I were having a debate as to how much tooth is actually filed nowadays. Is it just cosmetic? And from what I saw, it depends on the dentist. Some people really seem to get into the mode of it, and it literally is like using a metal rasp. So you can imagine how painful that is. But some people, it's just kind of superficial just a pass, 1 or 2 passes. But the tooth filing is known as metata in Balinese, potong gigi in Bahasa. And we kind of incorporated within our section on puberty in the exhibit. Prior to the filing, the individual is considered to possess animal instincts, and the ceremony is believed to remove the vestiges of these kind of behaviors, transitioning the individual to adulthood. The age for a tooth filing may vary, but preferably before marriage and definitely before your cremation. In photos from the 1930s, we can see Margaret Mead and her secretary, Mardi Kaler on the left-hand side, talking with people, and I believe that the person in the white t-shirt over there is Togog. And I'll come back with the, I believe that was the person you talked about in your. So we see again the same network and constellation of people. And the photo seems remarkably similar when I look at it to something you would see today, except that nowadays you have mass filings, mass tooth filings, and the dresses become much more opulent. So we come back to that cloth and the ethnographic moment of being there and seeing this cloth being used and then being intrigued by why this particular cloth was being used, and then connecting it to a rich hotelier in Ubud who could afford to buy this particular cloth for his family, and to learn from the people who sold the cloth to him that the cloth would then circulate through his extended family, would be used as an investment for the family. And the Ubud tooth filing in 2016, organized by and patronized by the royal family, the Banjar, and numerous members of the community, the 3 castes had their own individual platforms, their priests, and their paraphernalia. And initiates were dressed in white and yellow, and girls were dressed in ornate garments along with elaborate hairstyles. The person undergoing the tooth filing was laid on a raised platform, furnished like a bed with sheet and pillows, and each family would bring their own furnishings with them. And the initiate was sandwiched between a mat with amuletic drawings laid under the body, and the covers of various special kinds of cloth, like the songket, or there were simple tenun, weaves of checks and plaids, and of course chapuk. The cloths, as we know even from other sources, are believed to stabilize and protect the body as it transitions from one stage to the next. And I can imagine it's a very vulnerable, your soul is there and you're going through this process that makes you vulnerable. However, these fabrics don't just work on their own. They require suitable offerings to the deities. You need proper caste-appropriate priests. You need the various rituals that build up to the actual tooth filing. Inscriptions of magical letters on your teeth and your body. And of course, as you note in the pictures in the exhibit, there's a symbolic tooth filing, and then there's an actual physical tooth filing. And during this time, the initiate wears a small square piece of cloth called the kakasang that protects this portion of your chest where it's believed the soul resides, but I guess it's also connected to the chakras and their location on the body. So during the actual tooth filing, as I observed, members of the family stand around the bed, holding on to the young man or woman with their hands, looking very serious and sometimes also very anxious. The dentist, as he is known, doing the filing, places a small cylinder of sugarcane in the corner of the mouth to prop the initiate's jaws open, and uses a metal rasp to file the top canines as well as the 4 teeth in between. And in between these filings, is paused, and the initiate sits up and observes the result using a mirror or drinks some juice. Women sit around the bed, some sing from printed prayer books, and the goal is that the canines and incisors are filed down, leaving an even line of teeth. This is to come back to Susan's and my debate, how much filing actually happens. Maybe does it depend on your caste? I mean, does a lower caste get more filing than the higher caste? These are all questions we have to go back and follow up on. The last ritual is cremation. And we talk about mass cremations because these events are so expensive and they're best done when you share the cost with the community. The last mass cremation was about 5 years ago in Ubud, so this happens every 4 to 5 years. And in this particular scene, you see that the families are gathered around the graves of their dead. And they have dressed the graves with appropriate gendered clothing. So in every section you see when the anthropomorphization and the dressing of the entity is one way to mediate that ritual. And what they're waiting for is the moment when they will invite the soul out of the grave and then incorporate that soul into the effigy you see them carrying there in that state. So the cremation, basically, the actual burning of the body is only one small episode. It's this constant process of transmutation and transitioning the soul from one effigy to another, ultimately ending in an interesting use of textiles where you create the cremation shroud. So here we are fortunate once again to be able to go back to history and the archives and find both photographic evidence as well as this amazing rare cremation shroud, one layer of the cremation shroud called a kajang kulit. I believe Adrian has also published this image earlier of this particular piece by a well-known artist, Ida Bagus Madebala. And some of the philosophy behind this is that in Hinduism, the world and the inhabitants are made up of these 5 main elements, or the Pancha Mahabhuta. That's earth, water, air, fire, and ether, each corresponding to a particular state of solid, liquid, gas, radiance, and space. And the purpose of not just a cremation, but a specific ceremony called the Nyabin, the purpose of the Nyabin ceremony is to speed up this process of returning these elements back to their origin. So this could commonly be done by cremating the corpse, but it's more commonly done symbolically when it's performed without the corpse. So the effigy becomes the substitute body or the symbolic body, and then the deceased can then detach him or herself from the elements in peace and enter the land of the gods. The deceased soul is invited to leave the human remains, where it becomes situated in a series of effigies, as I talked about earlier, in a shroud called the kajang. And this rare kajang kulit depicts the cosmic astral body of the deceased person. The earth is depicted by the turtle, Bedawang Nala, and the 2 snakes or nagas. Again, this idea of binding and holding in tension. So this kind of textile object is rare, but if it was to be used, it would be burnt inside along with the other layers inside an animal-shaped coffin. Don't want to go too much into the actual layers, but this would be interesting if somebody wants to actually study what layers of cloth follow what and what is the importance of that hierarchy. But one layer would be the coin figures that you see on the right-hand side in Bateson's photograph, which again form a different kind of symbolic body made out of Chinese coins tied together. In an emotional ritual, the family members gather around the platform and pin these coins, at least in the version I saw in Ubud, to pin these ukur, pin the ukur or the measure of the body to the kajang. A process called najum, or literally to arrange. And above this is a structure made of palm leaves. Finally, we have a dantasan, or an offering of cloth or garments placed according to the gender of the deceased. And the same logic still continues even today. So this is actually the last slide of the talk. And I've used these 3 illustrations, no doubt very brief. There's a lot more we could go into. But to come back to an earlier point that literally this part of the symposium is about this idea of cloth as human experience and cloth as a social life in cultures around the world. In Balinese cosmology, the everyday and the ceremonial, the sacred and the secular cannot be clearly separated. Instead, they flow in a continuum of more sacred, and less sacred. Hence, cloth, I argue here, can be considered as processes of fabricating varying degrees and kinds of power, as well as being parts of rituals of kinship and continuity. Thank you.
Before we gather all our wonderful speakers together, are there some questions for Urmila? Yes.
In the tooth filing photograph, you had underneath the red cloth that was being brought down, there was a purple with gold thread cloth. I have one of those. Could you describe more about
It may
that?
have looked like gold, but I think it was actually silver thread.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of a songket. It was basically a songket. Extra weft embellishment with metal thread. It was silk, and I would see this layering of cloths. It's really, I think it's an element, I mean, you have clearly, there's a question of opulence over here and what you could afford, you know. And it seemed to me also that there was no strict rules as to what kinds of cloths you had to have. Some people bought songket, some people brought very simple tenun, some people had chepuk in this case, some people didn't have them. Other things I saw, some people came with grinsing, you know. And then there were some people who would put the grinsing on the pillow, so it wasn't even on the body. And what was fascinating was cloths from Flores and other parts of Indonesia also being used. Now, whether that's their power of being exotic and far away, or what the rationale is behind using those cloths, again on the pillow.
Other question? Yes.
Yeah, you used the term kajang kulit.
Yeah.
That means it was made of leather?
No, actually, kajang kulit as literally as the skin of the person.
Skin of the person?
Of the person, yeah.
Are they using the skin of the person?
No, I don't.
Okay.
They're not. I don't think they're using the skin of the person. It's more a reference to the person's human existence and the fact that they're living in a particular sort of, or it could be a clan or a group or some kind of family.
Is the word kulit can refer to leather?
Of course, yeah. That's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
One more. Yes.
I wonder if Margaret Mead herself was aware of the fact that the Dutch kind of industrial arts part of their colonial bureaucracy had introduced that semi-mechanized loom, the ATBM loom, a frame loom, for index manufacture, I think by the 1920s or so, in Klungkung area and so on. So I'm not sure when it got in, but it was before 1937, I think, wasn't it? Was she aware of that?
I don't have any documentation that I've seen so far of that. The only thing, not of the ATBM, like I said, we're looking at traces, and most of the actual documentation of looms actually is in the Covarrubias photographs, or in Colin McPhee's videos, films, sorry. But the actual, the Mead thing is not, she's not so focused on the actual making, it's more on the rituals. That's why we have these materials then. I mean, this fantastic material if you're interested in how bantan is made, different kind of bantan making, puppet making. I mean, there are other acts of making, but not textiles in particular.
Good. Well, let's thank Urmila for her wonderful presentation.